I'll start the session by saying welcome to Howard Gardner. He's Professor Howard Gardner of Harvard University. The talk today is going to be around discussing the future of universities. As part of the Labour Party Education Committee, we are looking at how we set policies to shape the future of universities. We have significant challenges in New Zealand. We've, of course, had COVID come through, which has put economic pressure on the universities. We have a mental health crisis in our universities. We have a disconnection with the country. Our universities are starting to struggle to seem relevant to all citizens. And so I think some of those challenges also reflect in the growing student debt. Many of our students can't afford to study at university. We've had a housing crisis here in New Zealand, and that housing crisis has lifted rents enormously. And so that lifting of rents has made it very challenging for students to come and be on campus and with us in person. The move to online has created a divide between haves and have-nots and the digital technology divide. So there are many challenges. As part of that, one of the things that we're looking at doing is how do we reference ourselves against other university environments? How do we shape our policies at the government level to provide a fertile environment for universities to find a good way of being universities? Now, in New Zealand, we have merged all of the DHBs as of yesterday. They are now a single health entity. Last year,
what's that initial?
DHB, so the district health boards. So we've taken all our health boards, which were all separated into small districts and individually operating within regions of a few 100,000 citizens, and we've made them a single entity across the entire country. We have taken our vocational training institutes, they're publicly owned ones, and we've merged them into a single vocational training provider for the whole country and aligned. And we've just had the work councils have just started up, which are a group that certify vocational training from an industry perspective, as well as us certifying them from an academic perspective. So we've had significant changes in vocational education in New Zealand. However, our university sector is kind of been left alone to some extent. We haven't had large changes. The biggest change we had was probably the introduction of our performance-based research fund, where we are funded on a individual assessment of university lecturers and their research outputs. So that was in the 2000s, we had that change. And we've had fees caps put on, which are down at 1.1% this year, is a cap on how much the university can raise their fees, which is below inflation, which again creates another financial challenge, right? So there are lots of challenges. So what we're doing is part of kind of engaging with society and trying to find ways to talk to people is doing some international referencing. So I have Professor Howard Gardner here with me, and we are going to discuss a recent book that he published, which was a result of 10 years of analysis of the US university system. So Howard, I can also introduce some of your work on multiple intelligences. You've been working in education for 50 years, too long, and have had significant influence on the way we think about intelligences and the way you evaluate people, because prior to some of your work on multiple intelligences, we had a very strong, almost modernist approach of a single scale of intelligence. And so I think your work on multiple intelligence allowed people to say, well, actually, no, it's not a single unitary scale that everybody should be measured against one thing. And I think that's really has shaped a lot of the discussion around education. It also is very important here in New Zealand, where we are a bicultural country. So we have Te Reo Māori and our Indigenous population have significant rights and are a partner in what we do. And so that creates a more than a single measure environment. So I'll hand over to Howard to introduce some of the justifications for why you did this research on universities and what were some of those sort of big findings and interesting findings that you had. Howard.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me and thanks for the background. As you know, this is a co-authored book, and I'm in fact the junior author. Wendy Fishman is the senior author. We've worked together for 27 years. And basically, we've worked at the intersection of psychology, education, and policy. And as you noted, the work in intelligence has, for better or worse, gone viral. And Wendy and I have also worked for many years in what we call the Good Work Project, trying to understand what it means for workers not just to be good at what they're doing, but to try to do the right thing. And our interest in studying American higher education came from a finding that's literally from the beginning of the century. We found that American young people who were college individuals knew what it meant to be ethical, respected people who were ethical, but said, we can't afford to be ethical now because we're ambitious, we want to make it, we want to be rich and famous and in demand. And then when we get power, then we'll be nice to people and we'll try to figure out the right thing to do. We were kind of astonished not only that people believed that, but they actually told us that. So they told it us kind of shamelessly. It's like somebody said to you, no, I got in medical school because I cheated. I mean, you want to be operated on by a doctor who cheated. So this was in the background for 2 decades. And we began, for a number of reasons, which I won't go into it, to say, what's really going on in American higher education today? Now, I want to avoid 2 fallacies. One fallacy is, the United States knows what it's doing and is doing it right, and we should pay attention to what it's doing, which may have been true 70 years ago about certain things, but anybody who reads the newspaper knows it's not true anymore. The second fallacy is our system is very different from yours. And for anybody who's listening, you're going to have to do a bit of a transplant. You're going to have to take what I tell you and what the book tells you and see what's useful for the New Zealand context and what is really not that useful. So let me start with 2 distinctions, which won't surprise you when I describe them, but you may not have thought about them before. First of all, the word college and universities have very different meanings in the United States. The university is a big place, which has all sorts of graduate programs and all sorts of professional schools, medical, law, architecture, dentistry. I'm in a school of education. It's a professional school. It's part of the university. It is not the college. So university is not college. And Simon is correctly using the word university. Our study is not a study of university. It's a study of college. Here's the second issue. College is something which exists and is very famous and popular in the United States. It really comes from England, but chiefly Oxford, Cambridge. And there are colleges all over the world, but they're a tiny minority. A college is an experience, typically 4 years, where, to use the term we use, students study liberal arts or liberal arts and sciences. And the idea of college is you don't choose a profession and go right to veterinary or journalism. You spend 4 years, you may be taking a topic which you know is relevant to being a professional. If you're going to be a lawyer, you might study political science. If you're going to be a doctor, you might study biology. If you're going to be an educator, you might study psychology. But you're not going to get a professional degree at the end. You're going to go on to graduate school, or you might go to the workplace. But if you go to Harvard College or Yale College or Princeton College or Swarthmore College, you're not getting a degree which allows you to be a lawyer or a doctor. It may allow you to make a lot of money, which is part of what our book is about. So again, I'm talking about the United States. It's not like any other country. there are some things to learn from it, negatively and positively. Your prime minister came to Harvard a month ago. I listened to her speech. That's your party, right? So
yes,
you feel good about her. She's very charismatic. On the other hand, as you may know, New York Times had an article this week. The New York Times would be inclined to be sympathetic to her, saying that she has a better press abroad than she does at home. And you shouldn't refute that. I'm just so that's the background to keep in mind. Anybody who's listening, say, well, try to figure out what's helpful for your particular situation. What do? Wendy and I spent 5 years studying 10 very different colleges. Some of them were part of universities, like Duke is part of a university, and some of them are just colleges. Kenyon is just a college. It's a college in Ohio. And these schools, I'm going to call them schools sometimes, they differed in how selected they were. Some of them it's very hard to get into. Some of them it's not easy, and some of them accept everybody. One college was an exception. You won't know about it unless you are into engineering. It's called the Olin College of Engineering, and even though it's only 20 years old, it's been enormously successful, and it's imitated, or at least it's studied all over the world. So we studied, just to recapitulate, 3 highly selective schools. Probably everybody in education would have heard of them. 3 moderately selective schools, and 3 schools which essentially accepted everybody. And then Olin was kind of a comparison school, but one that turned out to be illuminating. With a research staff, we carried out 200 interviews in each of these schools, so 2,000 interviews altogether. And we interviewed 8 different constituencies. Incoming students, which typically in the United States would be 18 and 19 years of age, graduating students who would typically be 22, 23, though some of them are much older. Faculty, you all know what faculties are. Administrators, we have a lot of administrators in America. Alumni, these are people who graduated 10 years before and who we contacted. Parents, most students have parents, and we interviewed them. And trustees, who are very, very powerful. They set the policy for the schools. And we also interview job recruiters. These are people who come to campus to interest students in a particular career line. And with each of these people, we carried out an hour-long interview, what we call a semi-structured interview. That means that some questions were asked of everybody. Some questions were directed more to particular constituencies. And while we made sure to hit all the high spots with each of the interview subjects, if in answering the second question, the subject had already answered the 8th question, we didn't say number 8, we said, oh, as you mentioned before. And this is important because one of our 2 major concepts is what we call higher educational capital, for abbreviation head capital or head cap. And our assumption, and you can argue with this, if you're on a train or an airplane, let's assume you're an adult, and you find yourself sitting next to a college, a university kid, and you talk to that kid for an hour or so, you discuss, who is he, where does he come from, who is she, what's she interested in, what she's studying, what her ambitions are, what's good about college, what's bad about college, what are the problems, what would you change? You would not only learn what that student thinks about college, but you would learn how much head cap they have. And head cap, and I'll put on your head cap, involves their ability to attend, analyze, reflect, connect, and communicate. So you're talking to this kid, and you're seeing, is the kid paying attention? Is he analyzing what the question is? Is he connecting among things, especially if we don't? Is he reflecting on how it all fits together? And then can he communicate? Can she communicate? That's head cap. And in a sentence, if head cap doesn't improve over the 4 years of college, you are wasting your money. If after 4 years of studying history or biology or economics or fine arts, you can't attend, analyze, blah, 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 better than at the beginning, you've thrown your money away. The other concept, which I think will be quite relevant everywhere in the world, is how the student thinks about their higher education experience in terms of what we call the mental model. That is, if you could get inside their head, what are they thinking? And we have 4 mental models. They're called inertial, transactional, exploratory, and transformation. Inertial is, well, I went to secondary school, now I have to go to university because my parents said so. Fortunately, in our schools, we very rarely come up with inertial answers. But there are students who don't really know why they're there. Transactional is by far the most common, and we were not happy about that. But we're telling you now what we found, not what we make of it. The students who are transactional basically say, I'm here, I'm going to do the work, try to get the best grades, get a job, and I'm out of here. Now, that may seem to you, not so bad, but they're in a liberal arts school. The school offers 50 different majors, from classics to astronomy. It has museums, it has libraries, it has clubs of various sorts. And you're just there to, do what you need to do to get out of there. It's a wasted opportunity. And I think even at universities, people would say, if all you're there, it's just to get the degree, it's not good. So there are 2 other mental models, which we are happier about: exploratory and transformational. Exploratory is, I'm 19 years old. This is a once-in-a-lifetime gift to go and live often in another city, to learn about things I've never heard about, whether it's anthropology or zoology, to join clubs which can expand my mind or my body, to meet interesting people who I wouldn't meet before, to spend time with faculty, have break bread with them. When I'm 20, I can do this. At 30, I can't. I'm going to be married. I have a family, a mortgage. You mentioned how housing sits. There's no time to do that. So it's a gift. And when people romanticize American colleges, and people have all seen movies about American colleges, whether they romanticize them or they make fun of them, it's this gift of 4 years. Transformational is, I'm a certain kind of person, and in many ways, that's fine. But I'm open to being a different kind of person who thinks differently, believes different kinds of things, re-examines my presuppositions about others, is affected by people whom I meet who I've never met before. And interesting thing is that both Wendy Fishman and I, the authors of the book, are first-generation students. Our parents didn't go to college. And first-generation students often, this is for extra credit, I'm the same age and came from the same city that Joe Biden came from, Scranton, Pennsylvania. Not well known because of me, but because of him. If you grew up in Scranton, PA, and you were ambitious, your major goal was to get out of Scranton. And I was very open. I went to college 60 years ago to become a different kind of person. So my values came from home, and I didn't change those for the most part, but many different ways. So just to recapitulate, the mental models are inertial. Well, college was next on the agenda. Transactional. I'll do what I have to do, but don't give me any other opportunities. Exploratory is, I'm in a wonderful candy factory where I can really learn about new things and meet new kinds of people. I want to take advantage of it. Transformational is, I'm open to be able to be a different kind of person, not in things that are sacred, but in things where my own background would be limited.
Now, I think from a New Zealand perspective, and talking about New Zealand students, so when we brought in fees, that certainly made some of it harder for the inertial students, right? It was no longer just that's just the next thing to do. It was this is going to cost a significant amount of money. So I think some of the inertial students you filter that way. And we still have some inertial students who just treat university as the next step from high school. but having gone through a lot of the information evenings, because we go out and do information evenings, and we have recruitments and talk to our careers advisors in high schools. So I've been doing that recently. There is an interest in what is the value of university, and from a lecturing perspective, we do have quite a lot of transactional students, as you've suggested is the highest number in your study. That is also a very large number here in New Zealand. And part of the challenge that we've been seeing recently is we changed our high school system to being a building up of credits system. So you build up credits over the year to get the qualification. And it seems to have moved students into an even more acute processing, a more transactional approach to the chunks of knowledge they're learning, that they're learning these puzzle pieces to put together to get to the credit they need, and then they move on. And so it's that kind of modularization.
We find exactly the same thing in the United States. And Wendy, the mother of four, three of whom are in college, is particularly interested in what she calls the pathological signaling in high school and secondary school. That all that matters is that you get high grades and go to the next place, and no notion that there's a world to explore, and this is the time to do so. And one of the things we did, which was very informative, it's in the beginning of the book, was we went on tours, on college tours, and Wendy could pass for a student. I certainly couldn't, or I might pass for a grandparent. And we listened to what people said about the school, and we saw to what extent the cognitive and learning aspects were emphasized, and they rarely were. The school was advertising the comfort of the dormitory, the number of award-winning restaurants, and sometimes Wendy or one of our staff would say, "Could we see a class? Because that's why the damn thing is there." And I'd say, "Well, we can't arrange that." So I have a grandson now looking at colleges, and I say, "Ask to see a class."
Well, I know I was watching some YouTube videos, and our universities advertise on YouTube and social media, and it was for the University of Auckland, which is one of our universities. And it had really high production value. It was a really flashy, well put together, well structured, organized advert. And I know that the lectures are not like that, right? And from the game industry, we used to have this problem, because I teach in the game industry. We used to have the problem of game trailers not being in-game footage. So you'd have like a movie scene of what your game was, and when you bought the game, it was blocky pixels, and it was kind of, that's not the game you sold me. That's another thing. And so this wrapping, the plastic on the outside. In fact, there was a process where for some of the very commercial games, they designed the game by designing the box art first. You would design how you're going to advertise the game and design the box, and then you would design the game to be minimally compliant with what was on the box. So it's kind of reversing that design process. And to some extent, we have the same problems when, with very competitive environment, you start squeezing people. And
I think, and I don't want to convey the notion that we want to blame parents or students. They live in a society and they pick up the messages of the sort that you and I are talking about. But, and this is our book is pretty controversial. It's criticized from the left and from the right, which makes us feel probably we're saying something that's right, that if colleges, not universities, if colleges deserve to exist, it's up to them to explain what they're doing, why they're doing, and then it matters. And two phrases from our book, both of which are almost self-explanatory, are mission sprawl and projectitis. Mission sprawl means we will give you everything. And we actually have word clouds at school that says, citizenship, democracy, friendship, travel abroad, 42 teams, blah, blah, blah. That's a mission creep. And most students don't know what the mission of the school is. If you remind me later, I'll tell you why I think religious schools have a big advantage over others. So it's that mission sprawl. And the other thing that's so American is projectitis. schools.
I have to. That's just not an American thing. We've got a massive. We've actually been going through in my university trying to list all the teaching and learning projects that are currently active, and it's like just a huge
nobody ever gets rid of something. They just add, and what this produces is confusion. And if you're confused, you resort back to what you know. Yes, after college, I got to get a job. So I will remind myself of what I asked you to remind me of before I forget. And that is that religious schools have an advantage. So do military academies, and something I wasn't aware of consciously when I wrote the book with Wendy, historically Black colleges. Those are schools that have been in the United States often for a century or more. If you go to a religious school, whether it's Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, or some cult that I haven't heard of, if you go to a military academy, we have some of those, or if you go to a historically Black school, or maybe even if you go to a women's college, so I don't think it's as true anymore, if somebody says to you, what's the school about? At least you have something to say, whether you like it or not, and it gives you a kind of a rootedness. A historical fact is until 1900, almost all of the American colleges were religious. Harvard was a Puritan school, and the early SEALs are all have God in it. And about 1900, we successfully dropped all of our religious connections. And we thought we were doing something good, but we destroyed the mission, and only schools which found another mission to replace it can allow students to say why they are in college. And a new book was just published called, I'm terrible at remembering names, but this one is easy to remember, God, Grades, and Graduation. American students who go to religious schools are much more likely to get good grades and to graduate. The lives they go on to lead, we could argue about, because often they don't aim as high as somebody who's secular. So you might have, let's say, two girls with roughly the same grades and activities at a high school, and the religious one will aim lower in where she's applying than the non-religious one. And that's because, as the author explains, the goal of the girl or the boy is not to make a lot of money and be king or queen, as my students that I referred to earlier, the students who we interviewed 20 years ago, we said, someday I'll be ethical. Their aims are to have a good family. If it's a woman, often she'll be primarily a mother and housemaker. So she wants a college degree, but she's not going to go to Wellesley or Vassar, which are more selective. She'll go to a state university.
So in New Zealand, we were founded in quite different ways. So we haven't any tradition of religious focused tertiary providers. We do have religious high schools, and single sex schools still are reasonably frequent. But at the university's missions, we have 8 universities across the country, right? So and they are geographically mostly distinct, though in Wellington there are overlapping campuses because it's our capital, and that means that there is an interest in having a campus in the capital city. But no, so things like Otago University, which ours were founded, the early universities in the 1890s. It built a culture around students and around that student experience, because the majority of the students weren't from within the city. So it was you go to Otago, and it was very focused on the student experience, much like a college would focus on a student experience. The university itself tried very hard to downplay the student experience to try and make itself feel more academic rather than just here's a party town. But the students generated a reputation. So we did have, and students would be able to identify some of the missions of some of our universities. But you're right, some of them, certainly the students don't necessarily engage with mission statements, or they won't even read course outcomes, right? In your learning outcomes in your courses, right? They won't read them. They just know what they have to do, and then they just do that. So,
but you're reminding me of two very important concepts from our book, and then I'll be finished with the cliff notes on the book. Onboarding and intertwining. Onboarding is whatever your mission is, whether it's religious or military or simply to make people who are good thinkers. That has to be something that students hear from the day that they apply. You know, the day that they send their application in, or the day that they're accepted, or the first day they're on campus, they're told, this is why you're here. This is what we want to do with you. And that's onboarding. And it doesn't have to be religious, but it can't just be whatever. One of the favorite words of this generation. Intertwining. Let's say the school has a mission, and it could be religious, it could be civic, it could be pluralization, pluralism. That has to be intertwined into the curriculum, meaning that it isn't that you take courses just like in students who weren't in a school with any kind of a mission, and then you have an extra course on, let's say, democracy. If democracy is the one other goal of your school, and I just picked that out of hand, that needs to be reinforced by the teachers, the therapists, the signage in the school, and so on. So you know why you're there. And again, you can see why military and religion are good analogs, because if you're in a military academy, you know the uniforms are on. And again, if you're in a Catholic school and they're priests and so on, you know why you're there. Harvard and Yale both have as their slogan, Veritas, truth. And when they were founded hundreds of years ago, it was for pursuit of truth. Well, I'll tell you an anecdote about, it's 8 years ago. There was a giant cheating scandal at Harvard. It made the national press because half the students in a course called Introduction to Congress cheated. And many people thought it was kind of poetic justice. But the leaders of the university said nothing about it publicly. And I said, that was the loudest noise of all. Because if your motto is truth, and when students cheat and lie, you want to sweep it under the rug, that invalidates your whole raison d'etre. And eventually people that speak up. But if you have a mission, you have to embody it. You can't just say, oh, well, we're at X school, but you're not going to see any signs of that.
Well, yes, I think the university I teach at, Victoria, it has a slogan of being a capital university because it's in the capital city, so it wants to be close to government, and so yes, it very much has a strong message around being law and business and connected to the government and governing of the country. However, that does create challenges for things like our faculty, which is the Faculty of Engineering, which doesn't sit perfectly with the overall mission statement, right? We are, and we're important because it's actually useful to be able to build things and make things and design things. But it's when you don't align necessarily with that core mission statement, individual faculties and schools within the university have more of a struggle to identify themselves. And in fact, so we had an interesting challenge is that our engineering, we did our own branding of think it, plan it, build it, right? So we had our own internal brand, and the marketing people said you could always tell the engineering students because we gave them out a t-shirt at the beginning of the first lecture. So all of them had a t-shirt and they'd all wear it with pride and they'd be wandering around the university and could spot them all. And it built that team, it built that cohesion among the engineers that, yeah, we're here, we're the engineers. However, that conflicted with the centralized unifying of a brand and having those odd off-brand wacky group pulling in a different direction isn't seen as brand uniformity and kind of cohesion. And so that was squashed by that central desire to have a single mission. So I think there's an interesting balance.
But let me say something which I never would have expected, and it's not particularly mentioned in the book. I think that given my analysis of what's the world needs, which you didn't ask me to.
I'm interested.
I think engineering may end up leading the way, because the control school, the comparison school that we include, remember 9 straight liberal arts, the other school was an engineering school. A student said to us, I'm getting the best of both worlds, a liberal arts education and an engineering degree. And because of how Olin College runs, students do get to study different things. And what's particularly impressive for me about Olin, I don't know whether it can be imitated elsewhere, is the students get to work in real life problems. And it's much more kind of what they'll be doing in the rest of their lives without just being vocational. A name that I just retrieved by luck, Frances Haugen, became world famous some months ago because she blew the whistle on Facebook and all the research at Facebook that had been lied. Frances was in the second class to graduate from Olin. Remember I said it's 20 years ago, she's in her middle 30s. She went there, and a lot of the Olin students have more of a liberal arts orientation, namely, how can I use my education not just to be the richest person since Bill Gates, but to do something that the community needs, in this case, blow the whistle at Facebook. So even though I know nothing about engineering, and I'm sure I couldn't pass an engineering course, I think we have a lot to learn. I think our colleges have a lot to learn from a successful engineering school, because it can intertwine engineering with standard liberal arts college subjects, and it can also be put to uses which aren't simply self-aggrandizing. I was just reading a book by Sarah Hendren, who teaches at Olin, where she organizes her whole course on building apparatuses for individuals who have various kinds of disabilities. And this turns out to be enormously motivating to students. Things we took for granted, like what should a parking lot be like? What should a podium be like? Once you say, well, let's say the person doesn't fit the average specifications, what do you do? Now, any school could do this, but engineering kind of has it a little bit easier because the kids they'll be making things and fixing things.
Well, and certainly, so I teach our UX engineering, so the user interface design, and we bring in one of my students was blind, and she gave a lecture on accessibility. So it is certainly one of the things that engineering can focus on, and so we do software engineering, computer science, and software engineering can focus on that end user, right? So it is. And once you know that you've got humans who are in the loop, right, that you're not just building something, but you're building it for people, then you can bring in all of those psychology aspects, you can bring in the disabilities aspects, you can bring in the social good aspects. And yeah, so we certainly, and in New Zealand, it is generally relatively easy to engage students with health or education or working with disability. So there is that general desire to have a public good.
Let me add something here. As I mentioned, the majority of students and the majority of parents were transactional. When we said if somebody said the purpose of college is to get a job, we said, and what happens if the job disappears in 3 years? It was the very rare student who ever thought about it. And anybody who's lasted till this point knows the whole employment, job, work dynamic is being totally exploded every month. And my daughter, who was at a business school, says to me, the only thing that you really need to learn in higher education is how constantly to deal with new problems in changing environments. And of course, that's one of the geniuses of liberal arts, is it doesn't just prepare you to be a first-year person at Goldman Sachs or at Google. It prepares you that if you go to a number of different places and do a number of different things, you can attend and analyze and all those other things. So people who talk about jobs in the year 2022 as if they were working for the Ford Motor Company in 1940 are deluding themselves.
Oh, I mean, we're having so AI is one of the things that is rapidly changing a bunch of the jobs, and in my own area in software engineering, the Microsoft has released GitHub Copilot, which is a programming AI tool, and they've just released that a couple of weeks ago commercially. and all students have access to it. And it does the low-level programming for you. So now you start just describing what you want it to solve, and then it shows you the code to solve it. And so already it can do most of our first year course, because if you can describe it well enough for a first year to implement it, then the AIs can implement it. And the tool is built in to the Microsoft tool. They looked at generative AIs with our law school, and it would the generative AIs would often solve first year law problems well enough to pass, because the language generation system has got so powerful now. And that's going to fundamentally change a lot of these entry-level positions, because the AI can do some of those very entry-level jobs. They can't do the advanced work, the work that we need people to actually do, but that transition from not being able to do anything to being a senior is becoming harder, because the AIs are starting to fill in some of those gaps. And I think this is a massive challenge for university and academic integrity, is your AI assistant a dishonest practice?
Is your AI assistant
a dishonest practice? Is it like spell checkers aren't, Grammarly isn't, but is getting closer. Like Google suggesting you're finishing your sentences, it's getting close to you not writing it. And certainly already in business, a lot of copy edit done on advertising is done by AIs. It's not done by people anymore. A lot of sports reporting is done by AIs, not by people. So it's kind of when does that tool built into the environment you're using, when does it become your work, and when is it someone else's work? And how are universities going to manage as we lose that ability to assess an individual, because we're no longer assessing them, we're assessing them and their fleet of AIs that they have access to?
Well, let me play Howard Gardner for a minute. We should think about the major professions. I don't know all professions, but medicine, law, journalism, education, nursing, architecture. The question to ask is, what is the fundamental reason why that profession arose? Ministry, I would add, and how should that be realized in the 21st century? And I haven't done that calculus, but I think we would find that for some professions, they're not going to be needed anymore. Let's pick dentistry. On the other hand, journalism, it's a category error to think that journalism could be done by deep mind. So, as long as you want to know what's going on, we're going to need to have journalists. Law and justice, certainly many aspects of law can be done by smart programs, but the decision of whom to try and how to convict and so on. At the most we'd want to do is to pay attention to statistics. And again, with medicine, at my age, I spent a lot of time with doctors. I'm very happy if the doctors don't have to do something which can be done computationally. On the other hand, when it comes to the decision, should I have surgery or not, I want to talk to three experts.
That kind of does taking that level, look at the role of university in society, right? When you look at those careers and you look at what the difference between a vocational and a university level or liberal arts is kind of the in a rapidly changing world, what should the policies look like? Now, I have a couple of questions from the audience, and if anybody here wants to ask questions, I know Hillary's interested. I've got a couple of questions I was going to ask. One from our Dean of the Faculty of Education is education less about learning and more about connection to information sources when required? Is it more connectivist than memorization? So, and that question of, are you just filtering sources or are you storing things internally?
Yeah, and I saw that question. I think anybody who would say that you should spend the bulk of your time memorizing should be sent to a lunatic asylum, because, almost anything that I could memorize, I can find here. And as you get older, you can't come up with names. This is a lifesaver.
I've started using mine as a real-time subtitling, because the AI built in here is pretty good at subtitling my words, and so I can actually wear a mask and have subtitling in real time, which is kind of interesting. But yes, so it is very different.
That said, I think that there's some things that's worth memorizing: beautiful poetry, music, so on. And clearly, while I don't think people should be asked to memorize stuff, if you have a good memory, it's a tremendous advantage. I didn't become a historian, but in old age, I'm spending a lot of time doing history. And it's so much easier when you have inside your brain lots of information about who did what, when, why, and so on. But there are textbooks that can help you. But the focus on memorization goes back to a very different kind of society, including even societies where there weren't books available.
Well, I know. So myself, I think of this as almost a transaction cost of how much effort it is to get a piece of knowledge. And when there's a very high transaction cost, the value of having it in your head is very, very high, because it takes so much to go and get it. But as the access to it becomes easier, that cost has lowered. Also, we have the problem of when you cache something in your brain, you're getting a copy of the world. And if the world changes, your copy gets out of date. And so you have that whole problem of how do I keep the copy of the world that's in my head up to date with reality? And so the stuff on Gapminder, that idea that students had a moral view of the world that was about 20 to 30 years old. It was the way the world was 20 to 30 years ago, not the way the world is. And that's because their mental model hadn't been updated with current information, because they'd kind of got that cultural input and the culture hadn't refreshed itself fast enough. And I think, it's becoming a challenge at universities, because many of our lecturers are older, and they're not, as we squeeze them, they're not given the time to refresh and update. And so there's a clash in that sort of value of tradition and the value of that culture and the changes that are needed. And I suppose that's so one of the questions that we also had was on academic freedom and on that ability of the academics to actually engage in some of this stuff. So doing independent research and having an academic culture that is supportive of that transformational mindset that you talk about in the book, because as we squeeze our universities financially, they behave more transactionally, right? They don't have the freedom, and the lecturers don't necessarily have a transformational view of their own role in universities. So,
well, let me mention something I've been thinking about a lot. If you do a survey of the American public now, most Republicans and a lot of other people think that college is a bad thing. They don't like college. And that's because they think kids just go there and fool around and become more liberal. If you ask them, what about universities? They would have a different answer. If you say, well, universities are the reason that we are forward in technology, and we came up with vaccines to deal with COVID and so on. And so if I were a salesperson for the universities, I would emphasize that. But I haven't done the study, but I would bet my meager reputation on it. Most of the good scientists in the United States went to college first, or if they came from abroad, they went to a secondary education, which was equivalent to college. Because, if you're in Germany or in Hungary, at the age of 11 or 12, there's a vocational track and there's an academic track. And the academic track is much more like college in the United States. I mean, you do languages, you do sciences, and so on. But the notion that somehow you can go from a mediocre American secondary education, which is what most students get, and then to become a good biochemist is naive. You need 3 or 4 years of exploring and doing, trying on different hats and working in a lab and seeing what things are like. So this is where the US system was traditionally impressive, but it's not easily transplanted to a place which doesn't have colleges and just universities.
Yeah, I know. So to some extent, our universities have been given a much stronger pastoral care role in recent years, right? Because of those issues of mental health that are coming through. And I certainly know one of the challenges that the universities feel is that being given a lot of responsibility for pastoral care to try and draw students through and help them in their entire life, right, rather than just their academic life. Without any resources or funding associated with that. So it's kind of what do we cut academically to put more resources into supporting an increasingly anxious population. And we're having challenges around it. Mental health issues used to be rarer than they are now, but it's not just the individual who's having a mental health crisis or who has a problem. It's also their friends, the people supporting them, and so almost everybody has become a secondary carer at university, and all of them are working second jobs, caring for each other, and so that freedom to explore has been continually contracted. And so I think it's so. One of the questions we also had was on different students with different ways of thinking. So, for example, I'm lucky. I came through, and it appears that I'm autistic. I've having an autistic daughter and a dyslexic son. Having gone through being a parent of those, it's become clear that I was autistic as a child. But I was lucky that I was able to find my track, and computer science certainly attracts a much higher percentage of autistic individuals than other parts of the university. But those different ways of thinking, one of the criticisms of HeadCap and your analysis of HeadCap is that some of those things I would identify as being extrovert behaviors. Some of that sharing of information or understanding how other people think, some of those processes were things that as an autistic person having a different mindset, you just wouldn't bring up and you wouldn't discuss, and they weren't things that are natural to talk about. And so one of the questions is how would you think of shaping policy to allow those different tracks of thinking to come in, and how does that fit with that HeadCap analysis?
Well, that's something I have thought a good deal about. And if I was czar, which I'm not, I would say that the two most important things are personalization and pluralization. Personalization is you know as much about every student as you can, which would include attention to the differences that you mentioned. Now, in the past, only people who were wealthy could get that kind of individual attention. But one of the blessings of the multimedia world is we can produce ways to personalize education much more. Mm. We don't have to teach fractions the same way to everybody. There are many, many ways. Pluralization is probably a more interesting concept. Pluralization says anything that's important can and should be taught more than one way. And if a teacher can only teach something one way, that shows that his or her understanding is limited. I think if you were to personalize or individualize and pluralize, you would open a much vaster space for people. The opposite is where there's only one way to teach. I know how to teach it. And if you don't learn it, it's because you're dumb. And even though my theory of multiple intelligence is controversial in psychology, it's common sense for anybody who has taught a lot of kids or who has a lot of kids.
Yeah, I mean the multiple intelligence stuff. Also, I can see how many of those map to neurological processes, right? So my PhD is a kind of neuroscience one on memory, and so I studied the hippocampus and the early visual system a lot, and seeing some of you at those multiple intelligences are just clearly different parts of the brain that are different processing units, right? So it's it's sensible that they would have different functionality.
Yeah. As you may know, that was probably the major catalyst for the theory, was because I spent 20 years working with brain damaged patients, and I could see that the loss of one faculty didn't predict that other faculties would necessarily be undermined. So again, biologists don't have trouble with the theory, but psychologists are looking for the test, and not everything can be tested.
So
psychologists.
Before we end, because I've used up nearly an hour, which is astounding. It's very easy to talk. This policy group that we're part of is around shaping university policy. So you, in your book, you give recommendations to parents and to students and to faculty. Though I didn't see a section on recommendation to government policy making around creating that environment that would support those transformational experiences. So what would be your thoughts on the kinds of government level policies? What kind of environment could we create that you would feel would have that the most benefit for students?
Okay, that's a better question than I have an answer for. I mean, there are two reasons to be wary of that in the United States. One is that we're a federation of states, and they have much more power than does the national government. Also, given our national government, I'd much rather that these decisions be made very locally. That said, if I were in a country which wasn't as dysfunctional as the United States, I think just one thing you said got my attention. I think the bargain needs to be, Simon, and this is new just from our conversation, faculty should have the power and the responsibility to design courses and curriculum and grade and carry out the research they want. But this is the part that they're not going to like so much. Our students need a lot more help with their mental health and their sense of belonging. I mean, I don't think anybody else has seen the book, but half of the book is on headcap and mental models, which we spent the bulk of the time on. The other half is on the sense of alienation, either from peers, from the academics of the institution, or some combination, or mental health, which even in 2012 was the biggest issue in the United States and colleges. I never would have thought that. I'm an old man, and if you talked to me 40 years ago, I would have said, look, students' problems are not my concern. And if a student seemed very disturbed, I would walk him or her over to the health services. I don't think we can have that distance. I think the bargain has to be made, academic freedom, but these are kids and you have a responsibility for them. And if you can't take that, then maybe we shouldn't have higher education. Mm. So you heard it first here, which means it hasn't been subject to any analysis, even by me. But we're dealing with kids and with a time that's very different. And even if it wasn't the pandemic, the fact that the whole work atmosphere has been exploded by AI and globalization and so on, we can't say if we're teaching classics, that's not my business. We have to be concerned with the whole young person.
Yeah, and so that is an excellent place to end on in terms of the recording in this chat, because yes, that is one of those challenges that very much aligns with what we're trying to think of as a policy, and trying to find ways to create the best environment for students and for society using universities. So I'd like to thank you very much. I mean, is there anything you'd like to add at the end? But thank you very much, Howard, for joining me.
I will add two things. One, to thank you for inviting me, particularly when you're not feeling as well as should be.
Right.
The other thing is that I was asked by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to edit a journal issue on higher education. And I said, if you want an issue on higher education in the United States, I have no interest in doing it because I know what everybody's going to say. I could write the thing. But if you would like me and Wendy and Bill Kirby, has a book out on education in Germany, United States, and China of the last 3 centuries called The Empire of Ideas. If you would like us to invite 25 scholars from all over the world to say what's going on with higher education so we could learn from them, I'd be happy to do it. And everybody who we asked said yes. So that's not going to help Prime Minister Ardern tomorrow, but I think we have to be prepared to learn from other people and to admit where we've gone wrong. And anybody who doesn't realize they've gone wrong sometimes isn't looking in the mirror with straight eyes.
Yeah, no, there are so many things that to talk about in this space, and so many ideas to share with each other, which is why we're reaching out and trying to find other views and how we build policy. I mean, one of the things that I do is what I call assessment by consent. So a bit like policing by consent is that you work with students to decide how they're going to be assessed, and then they shape the weightings, and so it's a mutual agreement that you come to, and you adapt what you do in that collaborative environment rather than I know what you need to learn and just teach you. So there are many of those sort of things, and myself, I still teach in Norway. So I taught in Norway for 11 years, which is an interesting collectivist Western society, and it is very interesting to see the different ways that education works between different countries. And I think that sharing is critical, because otherwise, like much of politics, you get stuck in your bubble and you don't reach out and you don't see other perspectives. You just see a reflection of yourself. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Feel better, and thanks for your interest. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay.